You want to learn more about ecofascism? A very good book that goes into that is called, surprisingly enough, Ecofascism, Lessons from the German Experience. It was published in softcover by the AK Press and co-authored by two people who have experience both in the German and the American Green Party milieu, plural, Janet Biel and Peter Staudenmeier. And Ecofascism was published in 1995 in softcover by the AK Press. Now, Ecofascism talks about the green wing of the Nazi Party and the blood and soil concept that they manifested, and one of the people who epitomized that was a German theoretician named Walter Darré. And in a section called Blood and Soil as Official Doctrine, they talk about the green wing of the Nazi Party. The unity of blood and soil must be restored, proclaimed Richard Walter Darré in 1930. This infamous phrase denoted a quasi-mystical connection between blood, the race or Volk, and soil, the land and the natural environment, specific to Germanic peoples and absent, for example, among Celts and Slavs. For the enthusiasts of Blut und Boden, the Jews especially were a rootless, wandering people incapable of any true relationship with the land. German blood, in other words, engendered an exclusive claim to the sacred German soil. While the term blood and soil, or going native, as I call it, had been circulating in folkish circles since at least the Wilhelmina era, it was Darré who first popularized it as a slogan and then enshrined it as a guiding principle of Nazi thought. Harkening back to Arndt and Riehl, he envisioned a thoroughgoing ruralization of Germany and Europe, predicated on a revitalized yeoman peasantry in order to ensure racial health and ecological sustainability. Continuing. Richard Walter Darré was one of the party's chief race theorists and was also instrumental in galvanizing peasant support for the Nazis during the critical period of the early 1930s. From 1933 until 1942, Darré held the posts of Reich Peasant Leader and Minister of Agriculture. This was no minor fiefdom. The Agriculture Ministry had the fourth largest budget of all the myriad Nazi ministries, even well into the war. From this position, Darré was able to lend vital support to various ecologically oriented initiatives. He played an essential part in unifying the nebulous proto-environmentalist tendencies in National Socialism. Quote, "It was Darré who gave the ill-defined, anti-civilization, anti-liberal, anti-modern, and latent anti-urban sentiments of the Nazi elite a foundation in the agrarian mystique. And it seems as if Darré had an immense influence on the ideology of National Socialism, as if he was able to articulate significantly more clearly than before the value system of an agrarian society contained in Nazi ideology, and above all, to legitimate this agrarian model and give Nazi policy a goal that was clearly oriented toward a far-reaching re-agrarianization." Unquote. This goal was not only quite consonant with imperialist expansion in the name of Lebensraum, it was in fact one of its primary justifications, even motivations. In language replete with the biologistic metaphors of organicism, Darré declared, quote, "The concept of blood and soil gives us the moral right to take back as much land in the East as is necessary to establish a harmony between the body of our Volk and the geopolitical space." Unquote. See, here is a mystical invoking of the blood and soil concept for the Drang nach Osten, the drive to the East, including all of the excesses of the Eastern Front in World War II. Continuing. More about Darré and the green wing of the Nazi Party under Hitler. Aside from providing green camouflage for the colonization of Eastern Europe, Darré worked to install environmentally sensitive principles as the very basis of the Third Reich's agricultural policy. Even in its most productive phases, these precepts remained emblematic of Nazi doctrine. When the Battle for Production, a scheme to boost the productivity of the agricultural sector, was proclaimed at the Second Reich Farmers' Congress in 1934, the very first point of the program read, "Keep the soil healthy," unquote. But Duray's most important innovation was the introduction on a large scale of organic farming methods, significantly labeled as Lebensgesetzliche Landbauweise, or farming according to the laws of life. And by the way, forgive my butchering of that phrase. Continuing, the term points up yet again the natural order ideology which underlies so much reactionary ecological thought. The impetus for these unprecedented measures came from Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy and its techniques of biodynamic cultivation. The campaign to institutionalize organic farming encompassed tens of thousands of small holdings and estates across Nazi Germany. It met with considerable resistance from other members of the Nazi hierarchy, above all Backe and Göring. But Duray, with the help of Rudolf Hess and others, was able to sustain the policy until his forced resignation in 1942, an event which had little to do with his environmentalist leanings. And these efforts in no sense represented merely Duray's personal predilections. As the standard history of Nazi agricultural policy points out, Hitler and Himmler, quote, were in complete sympathy with these ideas, unquote. Still, it was largely Duray's influence on the Nazi apparatus which yielded in practice a level of government support for ecologically sound farming methods and land use planning unmatched by any state before or since. For these reasons, Duray has sometimes been regarded as a forerunner of the contemporary Green movement. His biographer, in fact, once referred to him as, quote, the father of the Greens, unquote. Her book, Blood and Soil, undoubtedly the best single source on Duray in either German or English, consistently downplays the virulently fascist elements in his thinking, portraying him instead as a misguided agrarian radical. This grave error in judgment indicates the powerfully disorienting pull of an ecological aura. Duray's published writings alone, dating back to the early 20s, are enough to indict him as rabidly racist and a jingoist ideologue, particularly prone to a vulgar and hateful anti-Semitism. He spoke of Jews revealingly as weeds, unquote. His decade-long tenure as a loyal servant and, moreover, architect of the Nazi state demonstrates his dedication to Hitler's deranged cause. One account even claims that it was Duray who convinced Himmler and Hitler of the necessity of exterminating the Jews and Slavs. The ecological aspects of his thought cannot, in sum, be separated from their thoroughly Nazi framework. Far from embodying the redeeming facets of National Socialism, Duray represents the baleful specter of ecofascism in power. And more about the legacy of the green wing of the Nazi Party. And by the way, I recommend, for a better understanding of that, the book Ecofascism. Also, two other books go into this to an extent. The book Dreamer of the Day by Kevin Coogan, and also a volume we're going to use later, The Beast Reawakens by Martin Lee. Of the misunderstanding of the green wing of the Nazi Party under Hitler, the NSDAP, and seeing their green policies as somehow a good element of the Nazi ideology, the authors here, Janet Beal and Peter Staudenmeier, point out rather how it was the going native concept, the blood and soil concept that underlay the green element of the Nazi Party that precisely characterized that ecological rationalization for extermination in order to gain Lebensraum, in order to get rid of the weeds who were polluting the true relationship of blood and soil of the people who belonged in their little homeland. And this, by the way, has been updated and expanded to show how other little peoples in their homelands need to get their rights too, which just happens to break up countries that Germany and the Underground Reich and those who ally with it want to break up. The next section of ecofascism that we're going to look at here is called Fascist Ecology in Context. And talking about how the green wing of the Nazi Party has been understood or misunderstood by contemporary Greens, and as we're going to see, some fascist elements that have attempted to and successfully infiltrated and even co-opted elements of the Green Party. In Fascist Ecology in Context, Beal and Staudenmeier write, to make this dismaying and discomforting analysis more palatable, it is tempting to draw precisely the wrong conclusion, namely, that even the most reprehensible political undertakings sometimes produce laudable results. But the real reason here is just the opposite. Speaking more of the green wing of the Nazi Party under Hitler, even the most laudable of causes can be perverted and instrumentalized in the service of criminal savagery. The green wing, unquote, of the NSDAP was not a group of innocents, confused and manipulated idealists, or reformers from within. They were conscious promoters and executors of a vile program explicitly dedicated to inhuman racist violence, massive political repression, and worldwide military domination. Their ecological, unquote, involvements, far from offsetting these fundamental commitments, deepened and radicalized them. In the end, their configuration of environmental politics was directly and substantially responsible for organized mass murder. No aspect of the Nazi project can be properly understood without examining its implication in the Holocaust. Here, too, ecological arguments played a crucially malevolent role. Not only did the Green Wing refurbish the sanguine anti-Semitism of traditional reactionary ecology, it catalyzed a whole new outburst of lurid racist fantasies of organic inviolability and political revenge. The confluence of anti-humanist dogma with a fetishization of natural purity provided not merely a rationale, but an incentive for the Third Reich's most heinous crimes. Its insidious appeal unleashed murderous energies previously untapped. Finally, the displacement of any social analysis of environmental destruction in favor of mystical ecology served as an integral component in the preparation of the final solution. Quote, "To explain the destruction of the countryside and environmental damage without questioning the German people's bond to nature could only be done by not analyzing environmental damage in a societal context and by refusing to understand them as an expression of conflicting social interests. Had this been done, it would have led to criticism of National Socialism itself, since that was not immune to such forces. One solution was to associate such environmental problems with the destructive influence of other races," unquote. National Socialism could then be seen to strive for the elimination of other races in order to allow the German people's innate understanding and feeling of nature to assert itself, hence securing a harmonic life close to nature for the future, unquote. This, and the authors go on to comment, this is the true legacy of ecofascism in power. Quote, "Genocide developed into a necessity under the cloak of environmental protection," unquote. The experience of the green wing of German fascism is a sobering reminder of the political volatility of ecology. And the authors go on to go into great length about how some elements of the Green Party in Germany have been co-opted by neo-Nazi elements or have adopted some of the more insidious aspects of the green wing of the Nazi Party. Now, we're going to turn to a book I alluded to briefly earlier, a book called The Beast Reawakens. That was authored by Martin A. Lee. I've used this book many times in the past, and I've interviewed Martin Lee several times, and those interviews are available from the WFMU download website. You can also get them on CD from Spitfire. Turning to The Beast Reawakens, Martin Lee writes at considerable length about the Nazi infiltration of, and neo-Nazi infiltration of, and to a certain extent co-option of the German Green Party. Now, one of the things that I want to point out here, before we get into the pivotal role of veterans of the Third Reich in actually establishing the Green Party and its milieu in Germany, I want to point out that it was the Green Party and their opposition to NATO missiles and Reagan administration spurred armament that helped to persuade, and it was the green influence in Germany that helped to persuade Gorbachev and the Soviets to give the nod to German reunification. So that basically the Green Party in Germany was something of a force for peace initially, in that it basically was seen by the Soviets, and its influence was seen by the Soviets as a reason to justify, to give a nod to German reunification. Once that happened, several things happened. First of all of a sudden, the Green Party, along the lines of what we looked at in For the Record 627, began advocating a going native philosophy, a blood and soil philosophy, which, when applied to the Balkans, was actually a philosophy for war, for justifying German hegemony, for justifying the blood and soil philosophy applied to the Catholic Croatians in Yugoslavia, for justifying a blood and soil policy applied to the Bosnian and Albanian Muslims in the former Yugoslavia, and the Peace Party. That was how the Greens were seen in order to rationalize Soviet, or in order to, they were seen as a justification by the Soviets to permit German reunification. Then it metamorphosed from a rationalization for German reunification to a rationalization for the fragmenting of Yugoslavia in conjunction with German foreign policy along the lines of the going native / blood and soil philosophy. Oh, we must help the Croatians, we must help the Bosnians, we must help the Albanians. We must help them and their blood and their soil. And, of course, the U.S. and Britain and France, as Matthias Kunzel points out, were instrumental in helping to actually effect the armed conquest of the Serbs who opposed Kosovar independence, and that resulted in war crimes. But it was German authorship of the blood and soil / going native philosophy that precipitated that conflict. And remember that right after the German reunification, then again, the Greens metamorphosed from the peace lever to the war lever, and they metamorphosed from the rationalization for justifying German reunification into supporting the rationalization for the fragmentation of Yugoslavia. And the Greens, as we're going to see, during this very same period, were being infiltrated by neo-Nazi elements, and it was in this period in which the Green Party metamorphosed from lever for peace and German reunification to lever for war and Yugoslavian fragmentation that Petra Kelly, the head of the German Green Party, was murdered. We're going to take a look at her murder in just a minute. But it was right in this period when the Green Party was metamorphosing from lever for peace and German reunification to lever for war and blood and soil / going native justification for Yugoslavian fragmentation that Petra Kelly was murdered. But turning to Martin Lee's The Beast Reawakens, what we're going to take a look at is the pivotal role of a guy named August Hausleiter, who was not only a veteran of the original German NSDAP, the German Nazi Party under Hitler, he was actually a veteran of Hitler's beer hall putsch. Turning to The Beast Reawakens by Martin Lee, the first organization to call itself the Greens in 1977 was led by August Hausleiter, a bull-necked, red-faced veteran of Hitler's beer hall putsch who had a long history of involvement in extreme right causes after World War II. During the early 1950s, August Hausleiter's Deutsche Gemeinschaft, or German community, collaborated with the neo-Nazi Bruderschaft, which counted Otto Skorzeny among its key personnel. By the way, the Bruderschaft, as you can read in The Beast Reawakens or in Martin Lee's The Dreamer of the Day, the Bruderschaft was a group of pro-SS Nazi officers in the immediate post-World War II German army. Otto Skorzeny was one of the leaders of the Odessa, the post-World War II SS underground, and also a key operative of the Gehlen spy milieu and the Underground Reich. Continuing with Martin Lee's footnote about August Hausleiter, again, a bull-necked, red-faced veteran of Hitler's beer hall putsch and a veteran of the Bruderschaft. Shortly after the Socialist Reich Party of Otto Ernst Rehmer was banned by the West German government, Hausleiter engaged in secret talks with Rehmer's colleagues in order to preserve the political punch of the SRP faithful. The SRP-linked attorney Rudolf Aschenauer was an executive board member of the Deutsche Gemeinschaft. By the late 1960s, however, Hausleiter had swung towards the left in an effort to attract student radicals. His group, Action Community of Independent Germans, began to focus on ecology and anti-nuclear issues. Hausleiter subsequently became a father figure for the fledgling Greens, whose initial supporters included dissident conservatives as well as left-wing activists. In 1980, Hausleiter was elected chairman of the Greens, but was forced to step down after a few months because of his checkered past. By the way, Otto Ernst Römer was one of the SS officers who directed the liquidation of the July 20th, 1944 conspirators against Hitler. Along with Otto Skorzeny, Otto Ernst Römer, one of the main operatives of the post-World War II Odessa SS underground. And August Hausleiter, at one point elected chairman of the Green Party in Germany, a veteran of this Odessa network. And very quickly, about the Nazi infiltration of the Green Party that was taking place at this time, Martin Lee writes, the political cross-fertilization that ensued in West Germany around this time provided new opportunities for far-right strategists who were continually searching for ways to transcend their marginalized status. Toward this end, they sought to piggyback on the success of the Greens, which polled enough votes to enter the West German Bundestag, a feat that had not been accomplished by a radical right-wing party since 1949. Although most Greens were indisputably anti-fascist, some of them lacked the political savvy to realize that the neo-Nazis and other far-right miscreants had infiltrated their ranks from the outset. In 1980, the West Berlin chapter of the Greens, known as the Alternative List, expelled a contingent of national revolutionaries that had employed stealth tactics in an effort to take over the group. This was merely one skirmish in a battle for control of the Greens, as leftists feuded with brown elements inside the party. Left-wing forces ultimately prevailed, prompting eco-fascists and their fellow travelers to form a rival organization, the Democratic Ecology Party, headed by Herbert Gruhl in 1982. By the way, this is a very sanguine analysis by Martin Lee. I would suggest, rather, that some of the fascist elements within the Green Party escaped detection and are continuing to wield a pivotal influence. Now, again, it was right in this period, in 1991, when the Green Party was metamorphosing from the justification, the pro-peace rationalization or justification for the Soviets to permit German reunification, to the going native / blood and soil ethnocentric pro-war rationalization for the fragmentation of Yugoslavia. And it was right in this period when the head of the Green Party, Petra Kelly, was murdered. And we're running out of time on this broadcast, but again, in the For the Record supplemental section, not only will there be more text from the Martin Lee book published, but also this entire article from Mother Jones of January and February of 1993, an article by Mark Hertzgaard, Who Killed Petra Kelly? The official version, although some articles say that the German police never actually opened their files on the Petra Kelly murder, the official version was that she was murdered by her lover, Gert Bastian. Now, Gert Bastian was a former two-star general in the German army, although I have not been able to find the article, an earlier article that I read about the murder of Petra Kelly, supposedly killed by Gert Bastian, who also supposedly killed himself, was that Gert Bastian, as a young officer, was a member of the Bruderschaft, just like August Hausleiter. But in this Mark Hertzgaard article, Who Killed Petra Kelly?, it has more to say about Gert Bastian. He had an odd history. In World War II, he fought for the Nazis, failed in private business after the war, and then went back into the military in 1956. He was a member of the CSU, the far-right party, until 1963, when he began a long political transformation that by the 1980s landed him with the Greens. He later resigned, protesting that they were being too soft on communists by just focusing on U.S. missiles. And that's the guy that supposedly gunned down Petra Kelly and then killed himself, although there are questions about the forensics, and there are also questions because, according to one article, the German police have never made their files public, or not all of their files public. So who killed Petra Kelly and why? Was it her Bruderschaft / Nazi combatant lover? Who knows, folks? But Anyway, as they say, it ain't easy being green. This wraps up For the Record program number 628. It ain't easy being green. Nazi infiltration and co-option of the Green Party. This is being recorded on March 9th of 2008. My name's Dave Emery. Thanks for listening. There are some very strong fascist/Nazi trends within the Green movement, and they have actually managed to find their way into the Green Party per se, certainly in Germany and to all appearances in the United States as well. Let me stress at the outset, I do not want to be misunderstood as characterizing all or most of the Green movement as fascist or Nazi, but there is a very significant element of it that is. It appears to be growing, and in particular in the United States and Europe, there are strong link-ups beginning to develop between the Nazi element and the fascist element in the Green movement and the so-called 911 Truth movement and other ostensibly progressive political elements such as the depleted uranium movement or the movement against depleted uranium. At some point, we'll probably tackle this coalition of ostensibly progressive groups, but manifesting a fascist political construct. Perhaps we'll call it the depleted truth movement, because that sort of goes to the essence of it. But again, as we begin examining ecofascism, I don't want to be misunderstood as characterizing the Green movement as fascist. Indeed, the authors of this book have written this book specifically to alert people to the dangers within the Green philosophy, so to speak, of being seduced by the Nazi/fascist element within the Green movement. Now, in addition to looking at how the Green Party in Germany was one of the reasons why the Soviet Union felt that it could give a go-ahead nod to the reunification of Germany, the prominence of the anti-nuclear, pro-peace, pro-ecology Green Party on the German political landscape was one of the factors that convinced the Soviets it would be okay to give the nod to German reunification. No sooner did that take place than the German Green Party, ostensibly a vehicle for establishing peace and German reunification, metamorphosed into one of the activist parties on behalf of the various nationalities within the former Yugoslavia, and it was one of the driving forces advocating the secession of various dissident ethnic minorities within Yugoslavia, or Volksgruppenrechte, or going native as I call it, and it metamorphosed into a pro-war party and was one of the vehicles for advocating the dismemberment of the former Yugoslavia. In 628, we also looked at the green element within the Nazi Party itself. One of the main advocates, one of the main green elements of the Nazi Party, or green thinkers, was a fellow named Walter Darre, D-A-R-R-E. He in turn became a protege of Rudolf Hess, one of Hitler's top deputies. What we're going to do in this program, and borrowing on the text Ecofascism, Lessons from the German Experience by Janet Biel and Peter Staudenmeier, is to take a look at the pre-Nazi reactionary green movement in Germany. We're going to then look briefly at the green element within the Nazi Party under Hitler, and then we're going to take a look at how some of the contemporary green movements in Germany, or green elements in Germany, are recapitulating some of the fascist ecology concepts, and in particular mystified blood and soil fascist ecology concepts of the pre-Nazi period, those ultimately finding expression to a certain extent within the green wing of the Nazi Party. I want to stress that the fascist/Nazi element within the Green movement relies on mysticism and a mystical blood and soil kind of doctrine that will, I think, echo, to a certain extent at least, familiar to people who are acquainted with some of the philosophical strains within the so-called counterculture, or within the so-called progressive sector. And what you will perhaps see in this broadcast, why I always use the term so-called. We're going to begin by taking a look at the antecedents, the historical antecedents of the green wing of the Nazi Party. The chapter from which we're going to read is called Fascist Ecology, the Green Wing of the Nazi Party and its Historical Antecedents. And this quote, the first quote here, is from a Nazi philosopher, and it expresses the Nazi/ecological ethic. We recognize that separating humanity from nature,
from the whole of life leads to humankind's own destruction and to the death of nations. Only through a reintegration of humanity into the whole of nature can our people be made stronger. That is the fundamental point of the biological tasks of our age. Humankind alone is no longer the focus of thought, but rather life as a whole. This striving toward connectedness with the totality of life, with nature itself, a nature into which we are born, this is the deepest meaning and the true essence of National Socialist thought." Unquote. Of course, the term Nazi is a contraction of National Socialist. The full name of the German Nazi Party was the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or NSDAP. And then the authors go on to say, "In our zeal to condemn the status quo, radicals often carelessly toss about epithets like fascist and eco-fascist, thus contributing to a sort of conceptual inflation that in no way furthers effective social critique. In such a situation, it is easy to overlook the fact that there are still virulent strains of fascism in our own political culture which, however marginal, demand our attention. One of the least recognized or understood of those strains is the phenomenon one might call actually existing ecofascism, unquote, that is, the preoccupation of authentically fascist movements with environmentalist concerns. In order to grasp the peculiar intensity and endurance of this affiliation, we would do well to examine more closely its most notorious historical incarnation, the so-called Green Wing of German National Socialism. Despite an extensive documentary record, the subject remains an elusive one, underappreciated by professional historians and environmental activists alike. In English-speaking countries as well as in Germany itself, the very existence of a green wing in the Nazi movement, much less its inspiration, goals, and consequences, has yet to be adequately researched and analyzed. Most of the handful of available interpretations succumb to either an alarming intellectual affinity with their subject or a naive refusal to examine the full extent of the ideological overlap between nature conservation and National Socialism, unquote. This article presents a brief and necessarily schematic overview of the ecological components of Nazism, emphasizing both their central role in Nazi ideology and their practical implementation during the Third Reich. A preliminary survey of 19th and 20th century precursors to classical ecofascism should serve to illuminate the conceptual underpinnings common to all forms of reactionary ecology. Two initial clarifications are in order. First, the terms environmental and ecological are here used more or less interchangeably to denote ideas, attitudes, and practices commonly associated with the contemporary environmental movement. This is not an anachronism, it simply indicates an interpretive approach which highlights connections to present-day concerns. Second, this approach is not meant to endorse the historiographically discredited notion that pre-1933 historical data can or should be read as leading inexorably, unquote, to the Nazi calamity. Rather, our concern here is with discerning ideological continuities and tracing political genealogies in an attempt to understand the past in light of our current situation, to make history relevant to the present social and ecological crisis. The next subsection here is called The Roots of the Blood and Soil Mystique, and it reads, Germany is not only the birthplace of the science of ecology and the site of green politics' rise to prominence, it also has been home to a peculiar synthesis of naturalism and nationalism forged under the influence of the Romantic tradition's anti-Enlightenment irrationalism. Two 19th century figures exemplify this ominous conjunction: Ernst Moritz Arndt, A-R-N-D-T, and Wilhelm Heinrich Riehl, R-I-E-H-L. While best known in Germany for his fanatical nationalism, Arndt was also dedicated to the cause of the peasantry, which led him to a concern for the welfare of the land itself. Historians of German environmentalism mention him as the earliest example of ecological thinking in the modern sense. His remarkable 1815 article on the care and conservation of forests written at the dawn of industrialization in Central Europe, rails against short-sighted exploitation of woodlands and soil, condemning deforestation and its economic causes. At times, he wrote in terms strikingly similar to those of contemporary biocentrism. Quote, "When one sees nature in a necessary connectedness and interrelationship, then all things are equally important. Shrub, worm, plant, human, stone, nothing first or last, but all one single unity." Unquote. Arndt's environmentalism, however, was inextricably bound up with virulently xenophobic nationalism. His eloquent and prescient appeals for ecological sensitivity were couched always in terms of the well-being of the German soil and the German people, and his repeated lunatic polemics against miscegenation, that's sexual relations between the races, demands for Teutonic racial purity, and epithets against the French, Slavs, and Jews marked every aspect of his thought. At the very outset of the 19th century, the deadly connection between love of land and militant, racist nationalism was firmly set in place. Riehl, a student of Arndt, further developed this sinister tradition. In some respects, his green streak went significantly deeper than Arndt's, presaging certain tendencies in recent environmental activism. For example, his 1853 essay, Field and Forest, ended with a call to fight for the rights of wilderness, unquote. But even here, nationalist pathos set the tone. Quote, "We must save the forest, not only so that our ovens do not become cold in winter, but also so that the pulse of life of the people continues to beat warm and joyfully, so that Germany remains German," unquote. Riehl was an implacable opponent of the rise of industrialism and urbanization. His overtly anti-Semitic glorification of rural peasant values and undifferentiated condemnation of modernity established him as the, quote, "founder of agrarian romanticism and anti-urbanism," unquote. These latter two fixations matured in the second half of the 19th century in the context of the folkish movement, a powerful cultural disposition and social tendency which united ethnocentric populism with nature mysticism. At the heart of the folkish temptation was a pathological response to modernity. In the face of the very real dislocations brought on by the triumph of industrial capitalism and national unification, folkish thinkers preached a return to the land, to the simplicity and wholeness of a life attuned to nature's purity. The mystical effusiveness of this perverted utopianism was matched by its political vulgarity. While the folkish movement aspired to reconstruct the society that was sanctioned by history, rooted in nature, and in communion with the cosmic life spirit, unquote, it pointedly refused to locate the sources of alienation, rootlessness, and environmental destruction in social structures, laying the blame instead to rationalism, cosmopolitanism, and urban civilization. The stand-in for all of these was the age-old object of peasant hatred and middle-class resentment, the Jews. Quote, "The Germans were in search of a mysterious wholeness that would restore them to primeval happiness, destroying the hostile milieu of urban industrial civilization that the Jewish conspiracy had foisted on them," unquote. Reformulating traditional German anti-Semitism into nature-friendly terms, the folkish movement carried a volatile amalgam of 19th century cultural prejudices, romantic obsessions with purity, and anti-Enlightenment sentiment into 20th century political discourse. The emergence of modern ecology forged the final link in the fateful chain which bound together aggressive nationalism, mystically charged racism, and environmentalist predilections. In 1867, the German zoologist Ernst Haeckel coined the term ecology, unquote, and began to establish it as a scientific discipline dedicated to studying the interactions between organism and environment. Haeckel was also the chief popularizer of Darwin and evolutionary theory for the German-speaking world, and developed a peculiar sort of social Darwinist philosophy he called monism. The German Monist League he founded combined scientifically based ecological holism with folkish social views. Haeckel believed in Nordic racial superiority, strenuously opposed race mixing, and enthusiastically supported racial eugenics. His fervent nationalism became fanatical with the onset of World War I, and he fulminated in anti-Semitic tones against the post-war Council Republic in Bavaria. In this way, quote, Haeckel contributed to that special variety of German thought which served as the seedbed for National Socialism or Nazism. He became one of Germany's major ideologists for racism, nationalism, and imperialism, unquote. Near the end of his life, he joined the Tula Society, quote, a secret, radically right-wing organization which played a key role in the establishment of the Nazi movement, unquote. But more than merely personal continuities are at stake here. The pioneer of scientific ecology, along with his disciples Willibald Henschel, Wilhelm Bolsche, and Bruno Wille, profoundly shaped the thinking of subsequent generations of environmentalists by embedding concern for the natural world into a tightly woven web of regressive social themes. From its very beginnings, then, ecology was bound up in an intensely reactionary political framework. The specific contours of this early marriage of ecology and authoritarian social views are highly instructive. At the center of this ideological complex is the direct, unmediated application of biological categories to the social realm. Haeckel held that, quote, civilization and the life of nations are governed by the same laws as prevail throughout nature and organic life, unquote. This notion of natural laws or natural order, unquote, has long been a mainstay of reactionary environmental thought. Its concomitant is anti-humanism, quote. Thus, for the monists, perhaps the most pernicious feature of European bourgeois civilization was the inflated importance which it attached to the idea of man in general, to his existence and to his talents, and to the belief that through his unique rational faculties, man could essentially recreate the world and bring about a universally more harmonious and ethically just social order. Humankind was an insignificant creature when viewed as part of and measured against the vastness of the cosmos and the overwhelming forces of nature, unquote. Other monists extended this anti-humanist emphasis and mixed it with traditional folkish motifs of indiscriminate anti-industrialism and anti-urbanism, as well as the newly emerging pseudo-scientific racism. The linchpin once again was the conflation of biological and social categories. The biologist Raoul Francais, founding member of the Monist League, elaborated so-called Lebensgesetze, or laws of life, through which the natural order determines the social order. He opposed racial mixing, for example, as unnatural, unquote. Francais is acclaimed by contemporary ecofascists as a pioneer of the ecology movement, unquote. Francais' colleague Ludwig Voltmann, another student of Haeckel, insisted on a biological interpretation for all societal phenomena, from cultural attitudes to economic arrangements. He stressed the supposed connection between environmental purity and racial purity. Voltmann took a negative attitude toward modern industrialism. He claimed that the change from an agrarian to an industrial society had hastened the decline of the race. In contrast to nature, which engendered the harmonic forms of Germanism, there were the big cities, diabolical and inorganic, destroying the virtues of the race. Thus, by the early years of the 20th century, a certain type of ecological argumentation saturated with right-wing political content had attained a measure of respectability within the political culture of Germany. During the turbulent period surrounding World War I, the mixture of ethnocentric fanaticism, regressive rejection of modernity, and genuine environmental concern proved to be a very potent potion indeed. The next section is called The Youth Movement and the Weimar Era, and I think people will recognize some very, very distinct echoes in the recent past here. The chief vehicle for carrying this ideological constellation to prominence was the youth movement, an amorphous phenomenon which played a decisive but highly ambivalent role in shaping German popular culture during the first 3 tumultuous decades of the 20th century. Also known as the Wandervogel, or wandering birds, or wandering free spirits, the youth movement was a hodgepodge of countercultural elements blending neo-romanticism, Eastern philosophies, nature mysticism, hostility to reason, and a strong communal impulse in a confused, but no less ardent search for authentic, non-alienated social relations. Their back-to-the-land emphasis spurred a passionate sensitivity to the natural world and the damage it suffered. They have been aptly characterized as right-wing hippies, unquote, for although some sectors of the movement gravitated toward various forms of emancipatory politics, though usually shedding their environmentalist trappings in the process, most of the Wandervogel were eventually absorbed by the Nazis. This shift from nature worship to Führer worship is worth examining. The various strains of the youth movement shared a common self-conception. They were a purportedly non-political, unquote, response to a deep cultural crisis, stressing the primacy of direct emotional experience over social critique and action. They pushed the contradictions of their time to the breaking point, but were unable or unwilling to take the final step toward organized, focused social rebellion, quote, convinced that the changes they wanted to effect in society could not be brought about by political means, but only by the improvement of the individual, unquote. This proved to be a fatal error. Broadly speaking, two ways of revolt were open to them. They could have pursued their radical critique of society, which in due course would have brought them into the camp of social revolution, but the Wandervogel chose the other form of protest against society, romanticism. This posture lent itself all too readily to a very different kind of political mobilization, the unpolitical zealotry of fascism. The youth movement did not simply fail in its chosen form of protest, it was actively realigned when its members went over to the Nazis by the thousands. We're going to continue with this analysis in Side 2 of the program. I've been reading from the book Ecofascism, Lessons from the German Experience, co-authored by Janet Biel and Peter Staudenmeier, published in 1995 by the AK Press in softcover. I emphatically encourage interested listeners to get a hold of this book and flesh out their understanding, and also to use the many audio files and print files available on the Spitfire website at www.spitfirelist.com and linked websites, and there are many of them. The websites are a vast and growing body of information. Please use them. We left off in Side 2 talking about the Wandervogel, or wandering birds, kind of right-wing hippies as they were described. They were part of the blood and soil mystified ecological movement, which ultimately gave rise to the green wing of the Nazi Party. Now, even though some of the causes that and some of the particular stances that are advocated by these fascist Greens will resonate sympathetically with some members of the audience, and indeed there are some aspects of it that I agree with, one should be very, very clear about understanding that this is the wrong way to use some right things. It's like fire. You can use it to warm yourself, you can use it to cook food, or you can use it as an instrument of terrible destruction. It's up to you. Or water. You can use water to put out a fire, you can use water to water a garden or to quench your thirst, or you can use it for waterboarding. It's up to you. So let's plunge right back into the book Ecofascism, Lessons from the German Experience. And again, please get the book. I have no connection whatsoever with either author or the publisher. Get no money from it, but it's an important book, and I recommend it. We're going to plunge right in talking about the pre-Nazi antecedents of the Green Wing of the Nazi Party that we spoke about last week in For the Record 628. Talking about the Wandervogel, most of whom became Nazis, the author's right. The attraction such perspectives exercised on idealistic youth is clear. The enormity of the crisis seemed to enjoin a total rejection of its apparent causes. It is in the specific form of this rejection that the danger lies. Here, the work of several more theoretical minds from that period is instructive. The philosopher Ludwig Klages, K-L-A-G-E-S, profoundly influenced the youth movement and particularly shaped their ecological consciousness. He authored a tremendously important essay titled Man and Earth, unquote, for the legendary Meissner gathering of the Wandervogel in 1913. An extraordinarily poignant text and the best known of all of Klages' work, it is not only, quote, one of the very greatest manifestos of the radical eco-pacifist movement in Germany, unquote, but also a classic example of the seductive terminology of reactionary ecology. Man and Earth anticipated just about all of the themes of the contemporary ecology movement. It decried the accelerating extinction of species, disturbance of global ecosystematic balance, deforestation, for destruction of aboriginal peoples and of wild habitats, urban sprawl, and the increasing alienation of people from nature. In emphatic terms, it disparaged Christianity, capitalism, economic utilitarianism, hyperconsumption, and the ideology of progress, unquote. It even condemned the environmental destructiveness of rampant tourism and the slaughter of whales, and displayed a clear recognition of the planet as an ecological totality. And all of this in 1913. And again, all of that from saving the whales to the disturbance of global ecosystemic balance, deforestation, themes very much in keeping with the ecology movement of today, and things that I agree with. But watch how this plays out, and that's one of the things that makes this so seductive. And again, looking at the fascist element in the Green Movement and today, and how that's hooking up with elements of the 911 Truth movement and some really reactionary political elements. This should hopefully alert people to begin sniffing the air very carefully when around elements like this. Of Klages and his work, the authors write, "It may come as a surprise, then, to learn that Klages was throughout his life politically arch-conservative and a venomous anti-Semite. One historian labels him a Völkisch fanatic, and another considers him simply an intellectual pacemaker for the Third Reich, unquote, who paved the way for fascist philosophy in many important respects," unquote. In Man and Earth, a genuine outrage at the devastation of the natural environment is coupled with a political subtext of cultural despair. Klages' diagnosis of the ills of modern society, for all its declamations about capitalism, always returns to a single culprit: Geist, or spirit. His idiosyncratic use of this term, which means mind or intellect, was meant to denounce not only hyper-rationalism or instrumental reason, but rational thought itself. Such a wholesale indictment of reason cannot help but savage political implications. It forecloses any chance of rationally reconstructing society's relationship with nature, and justifies the most brutal authoritarianism. But the lessons of Klages' life and work have been hard for ecologists to learn. In 1980, Man and Earth was republished as an esteemed and seminal treatise to accompany the birth of the German Greens. And we talked about the German Greens, the murder of Petra Kelly by her Nazi significant other, former two-star general in the Bundeswehr, last week. And that, again, right in the period when the Green Party was metamorphosing for the peaceful rationale for allowing German reunification on the part of the Soviets, to the Volksgruppen Rechte advocate of Yugoslavian fragmentation, and the result, which was the first major land war in Europe since the end of World War II. Talking about how the von der Vogel, the youth movement, in turn helped to spur the birth of the Green movement, the Green wing of the Nazi Party. And again, large numbers of the von der Vogel were incorporated into the early Nazi movement. In addition to the youth movement and proto-fascist philosophies, there were, of course, practical efforts at protecting natural habitats during the Weimar period. Many of these projects were profoundly implicated in the ideology which culminated in the victory of blood and soil, unquote. A 1923 recruitment pitch for a woodlands preservation outfit gives a sense of the environmental rhetoric of the time. Quote, "In every German breast the German forest quivers with its caverns and ravines, crags and boulders, waters and winds, legends and fairy tales, with its songs and its melodies, and awakens a powerful yearning and a longing for home. In all German souls, the German forest lives and weaves with its depth and breadth, its stillness and strength, its might and dignity, its riches and its beauty. It is the source of German inwardness, of the German soul, of German freedom. Therefore, protect and care for the German forest for the sake of the elders and the youth, and join the new German League for the Protection and Consecration of the German Forest," unquote. The mantra-like repetition of the word German, unquote, and the mystical depiction of the sacred forest fused together once again nationalism and naturalism. This intertwinement took on a grisly significance with the collapse of the Weimar Republic. For alongside such relatively innocuous conservation groups, another organization was growing which offered these ideas as a hospitable home: the National Socialist German Workers' Party, known by its acronym NSDAP. Drawing on the heritage of Arndt, Riehl, and Haeckel, and others, all of whom were honored between 1933 and 1945 as forebearers of triumphant National Socialism, the Nazi movement's incorporation of environmentalist themes was a crucial factor in its rise to popularity and state power. The reactionary ecological ideas whose outlines are sketched above exerted a powerful and lasting influence on many of the central figures in the NSDAP. Weimar culture, after all, was fairly awash in such theories, but the Nazis gave them a peculiar inflection. The National Socialist religion of nature, as one historian has described it, was a volatile admixture of primeval Teutonic nature mysticism, pseudoscientific ecology, irrationalist anti-humanism, and a mythology of racial salvation through a return to the land. Its predominant themes were natural order, organicist holism, and denigration of humanity. Quote, "Throughout the writings not only of Hitler but of most Nazi ideologues, one can discern a fundamental deprecation of humans vis-à-vis nature, and, as a logical corollary to this, an attack upon human efforts to master nature." Unquote. Quoting a Nazi educator, the same source continues, "Anthropocentric views in general had to be rejected. They would be valid only, quote, if it is assumed that nature has been created only for man. We decisively reject this attitude. According to our conception of nature, man is a link in the living chain of nature, just as any other organism." Unquote. Such arguments have a chilling currency within contemporary ecological discourse. The key to social ecological harmony is ascertaining, quote, "the eternal laws of nature's processes," that a quote from Hitler, "and organizing society to correspond to them." The Führer was particularly fond of stressing, quote, "the helplessness of humankind in the face of nature's everlasting law," unquote. Echoing Haeckel and the monists, Mein Kampf announces, quote, "when people attempt to rebel against the iron logic of nature, they come into conflict with the very same principles to which they owe their existence as human beings. Their actions against nature must lead to their own downfall." And to give people an idea of how some of the most heinous Nazis exhibited some aspects of pro-ecology philosophy that will resonate with many people, and to give people an idea of how seductive this can be, skipping down, such musings, it must be stressed, were not mere rhetoric. They reflected firmly held beliefs and indeed practices at the very top of the Nazi hierarchy, which are today conventionally associated with ecological attitudes. Both Hitler himself and Himmler, head of the SS, were strict vegetarians and animal lovers, attracted to nature mysticism and homeopathic cures, and staunchly opposed to vivisection and cruelty to animals. Himmler even established experimental organic farms to grow herbs for SS medicinal purposes. And Hitler, at times, could sound like a veritable green utopian discussing authoritatively and in detail various renewable energy sources, including environmentally appropriate hydropower and producing natural gas from sludge as alternatives to coal, and declaring, quote, "water, winds, and tides," unquote, as the energy path of the future. And again, the authors point out that the fact that some of these are good ideas should not lead people to revise their views of Nazism, but rather to understand how this can be used as a rationale for, among other things, exterminating large numbers of people. And again, we talked at greater length and in greater detail last week about the Green movement within the Nazi Party. And what we're going to look at next concerns some of the ways in which the contemporary Green movement and the Green Party in Germany in particular have incorporated some of the ecofascism of the pre-Nazi von der Vogel and German ecology movement, and also the Green wing of the Nazi Party itself. We're going to talk now about how Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy philosophy have been incorporated by elements of the Greens, and I can only recommend to people that they get a hold of the book to flesh out their understanding of Rudolf Steiner and how anthroposophy fits into this. But we're going to take note of the fact that among other institutions, the Siemens and Bertelsmann corporations, both of them German core corporations, and both of them therefore inevitably governed by the Bormann Capital Network, the economic component of a Third Reich going underground, about which I speak so often, and about which listeners can inform themselves by downloading the remarkable book Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile by the heroic Paul Manning. It's available for download for free on the Spitfire website. Bertelsmann, of course, the largest English-language publisher, also deeply involved in music. Bertelsmann was the publisher for the SS in World War II. Heinrich Mohn, its patron, was a member of the SS, and Dirk Bovendam, their house historian, has published numerous books blaming World War II on Jewish control of the news media, Jewish control of Hollywood, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the most recently published of those titles in 1998, and he's the official house historian of the largest English-language publisher, and also a company that is financing anthroposophy. Of the anthroposophical ideas and how they are incorporated into the green Nazi philosophy, we read, anthroposophical ideas are eminently usable by eco-fascists today, and there is a strong right wing within the anthroposophist that is closely connected with the ultra-right. Author Gunter Bartsch is an anthroposophist who is also a national revolutionary of the solidarist variety, the author of an adulatory 1989 biography of brown shirt leader Otto Strasser. He attempts in his publications to synthesize ecological themes based on Steiner's ideas with Strasser's political ideas. It should be noted that anthroposophy is also well funded by huge multinational corporations like Siemens and Bertelsmann. Next, the authors talk about Werner Georg Haverbeck, who was an actual veteran of the early Nazi Party, of the entire Nazi period. In fact, he was a veteran of the beer hall putsch, as was Green pioneer August Hausleiter, whom we looked at last week. And take note of Haverbeck and his continuity of activism from the early Nazi period of the 20s right on up through the contemporary period, and he in turn is one of the people involved with something called the World League for the Protection of Life, or WSL, which is a very well-funded, albeit numerically small, reactionary environmental organization in the contemporary Federal Republic of Germany. The authors write, among the ultra-right adherents of anthroposophy today are officials of the World League for the Protection of Life, or WSL, a small but influential and very wealthy environmental organization in the Federal Republic. The garden at its educational center is cultivated according to biodynamic methods, and visitors are served organic refreshments. Yet this organization was founded in 1958 by former members of the National Socialist Party, or Nazi Party, and today it links protection of life, that is, right-to-life themes, and the environment with racism and a revival of folkish ideology. The life it is most interested in protecting is, of course, German life. Thus, the WSL is rabidly anti-abortion, believing that German women should be devoted to giving birth to Aryan, unquote, babies. The spiritual leader of the WSL and its key figure for most of its history has been Werner Georg Haverbeck. Born in 1909, Haverbeck became an active Nazi at an early age. It should be recalled that Nazism was largely a youth movement, so that members like Haverbeck are still alive. Haverbeck joined the SA in 1928, and from 1929 to 1932 was a member of the Reich administration for the National Socialist Student League, Reichsleitung der NSDAP Studentenschaft, and a leader of the Reich Youth Leadership of the Hitler Youth, and I'm not even going to attempt that German title. Continuing, he served as a leading official of the Strength Through Joy organization, which controlled recreational activities under the Third Reich. In 1933, Rudolf Hess saw to it that Haverbeck's passport was stamped, "This man is not to be arrested," unquote. He survived the Ernst Röhm purge to help organize the Nuremberg Party Congress and join Hess's staff. It was Hess who converted him to anthroposophy. During the war, he conducted radio propaganda in Denmark and worked in South America. By the end of the war, he was an officer. After the Allies rudely aborted Haverbeck's many efforts on behalf of the Third Reich, he contented himself for a time working as a pastor for the anthroposophical Christian community. He founded an educational center called the Collegium Humanum in 1963, where today eco-fascist, esoteric, folkish, anthroposophist, neo-pagan, and primitivist groups meet and hold workshops. He co-founded the WSL and served as its president from 1974 to 1982. In 1981, he was a signatory of the notorious Heidelberg Manifesto, a document drawn up by a group of professors to warn the German people of the dangers that immigration posed to them. Its first draft began, quote, "With grave concern we observe the subversion of the German people through the influx of many millions of foreigners and their families, the foreignization of our language, our culture, and our nationhood. Already many Germans have become foreigners in their own districts and workplaces, and thus in their own Heimat." By the way, Heimat literally translates homeland, but it's a sort of a mystical blood and soil concept. Continuing. Routine as this language may sound now, when opposition to immigration in the Federal Republic is much more tolerated and neo-fascists pander to it relentlessly, the manifesto had to be toned down at the time, 1981, because of the public outcry it raised. In accordance with anthroposophical root race beliefs, Haverbeck is notable for propounding the thesis that the two world wars in this century in fact constituted a 30 years war waged by foreign aggressors against the German people and their spiritual life. Apparently, German spiritual life stood in the way of, quote, "the strivings for world domination by the Anglo-Saxon race," unquote, behind which lay the intensive image of a call to world dominance like the old Jewish consciousness, unquote. Indeed, Haverbeck maintains the two world wars amounted to a conspiracy against the German people and spiritual life. It is an historical lie that the Nazis ran mass murder camps, unquote, argues Haverbeck, and is actually enemy propaganda, unquote. It was Russia that was the aggressor in the Second World War. And that again from one of the figures on the contemporary green scene in Germany. We're going to turn next to another of the eco-fascists in contemporary Germany, someone who has drawn on the political and cultural and philosophical trends of the green wing of the Nazi movement, its antecedents such as the Wandervogel in Weimar and pre-Weimar Germany, and is in many ways recapitulating eco-fascism and some of the key features of the green wing of the Nazi Party within the contemporary green movement. And people who are involved with ecological causes should be attuned to these dangers. Rudolf Barrow, B-A-H-R-O, the authors write, "If fascists are using ecological themes to update their racial and nationalist aims, other thinkers are developing an ecological spiritualism along New Age lines that bears no small resemblance to the Völkisch Germanic spirituality of the 1920s. Indeed, quote, a great part of the literature about close-to-nature spirituality that the alternative scene is reading is permeated with reactionary, Völkisch, or even National Socialist content," writes Ditfurth. "We find," again quoting, "we find neo-fascist and ultra-right positions not only in the various political and even ecological groups, but also in neo-pagan, esoteric, and occult circles," unquote. Perhaps the most prominent figure in this connection is Rudolf Barrow. Many German New Social Movement circles previously accepted Barrow as a social theorist contributing to a socialism with a human face, unquote, and continue to regard him as part of the independent left. Leftist periodicals publish uncritical interviews with him. In the Anglo-American world, too, many radical ecologists can still consider Barrow as representing something leftist, unquote. Yet Barrow no longer considers himself a leftist. Indeed, he is a vehement critic of the left and of comrades without fatherland, unquote. In fact, as anti-fascist researcher Roger Niedenfuhr argues, since the mid-1980s, Barrow has been contributing to the development of a spiritual fascism, unquote, that has the effect of rehabilitating National Socialism, unquote, openly calling for reclaiming the positive side of the Nazi movement. Not only does Barrow appeal to a mystical Germanist spirituality like the Völkisch ideologies of the 1920s, He even sees the need for a green Adolf, unquote, who will lead Germans out of their own folk depths, unquote, and into ecological salvation, unquote. Barrow originally became well known as the author of The Alternative in Eastern Europe, which he wrote during the 1970s when he was a dissident Marxist and party member in the former East Germany. In 1977, the ruling communist government sentenced him to prison. In 1979, he was deported. Once arrived in what was then West Germany, Barrow became involved with the nascent German Greens, affirming that, quote, red and green go well together, unquote. In the early 1980s peace movement, he alarmed many by enunciating nationalistic arguments against the deployment of Pershing missiles. He began to speak less in political terms and more in religious terms, asking that, quote, the emphasis be shifted from politics and the question of power towards the cultural level to the prophetic level. Our aim has to be the reconstruction of God, unquote. He became a vocal fundamentalist critic of the Realo wing of the Greens, those who became generally committed to exercising parliamentary power, and ultimately left the Green Party in 1985. In a parting speech in Hamburg, he said there were structural similarities between the Greens and the Nazi movement that the Greens were not taking advantage of but should. Then he gave his fundamentalist alternative, quote, the other republic that we want will be an association of communities, of life communities in which God and Goddess are at the center, unquote. Barrow thereafter moved increasingly toward the New Age esoteric milieu. His major concern remained, quote, the ecological crisis, unquote, whose deep structures, unquote, must be investigated, but he now thinks ecology, quote, has nothing to do with left and right, unquote. Today, Barrow is one of the leading spokespeople and the theorists of New Age ideas in the Federal Republic. The most important thing, he rambles, is that people take the path back and align themselves with the great equilibrium, with a capital G and a capital E, in the harmony between the human order and the Tao of life. I think the esoteric political theme of King and Queen of the World is basically the question of how men and women are to comprehend and interact with each other in a spiritually comprehensive way. Whoever does not bring themselves to cooperate with the world government or Weltgattung will get their due, unquote. And again, note as we proceed with this, the degree of overlap and many of the similarities to elements of, quote, progressive, unquote, thinking and politics in this country, the so-called New Age in particular. In 1989, Barrow co-founded a combination educational center and commune near Trier, the Lernwerkstatt, or Ecological Academy for One World, unquote, whose purpose is to synthesize spirituality and politics, again quoting, to come to a new personal and social orientation. It presents lectures, cultural events, and weekend workshops on various New Age themes, including deep ecology, ecofeminism, Zen Buddhism, holistic nutrition, Sufism, and the like, as well as German identity. His 1987 book, Logik der Rettung, marked an overt embrace of authoritarian theological concepts that shocked many former advisors. And skipping down, since the mid-1980s, Barrow has been remarkably open about proclaiming his embrace of the spiritual content of fascism for the salvation of nature and humanity. In The Logic of Salvation, he asks, quote, is there really no thought more reprehensible than a new 1933, that is, Hitler's rise to state power? But that is precisely what can save us. The ecology and peace movement is the first popular German movement since the Nazi movement. It must co-redeem Hitler. Indeed, quote, the Nazi movement was, among other things, an early reading of the ecology movement, unquote. Germans are to look for, quote, the positive that may lie buried in the Nazi movement and reclaim it, he says, because if we do not, we will remain cut off from our roots, the roots from which will grow that which will save us. Today, one must liberate the brown parts in the German character. The fact is, says Barrow, that today there is a call in the depths of the Volk for a green Adolf, unquote. And in order to educate yourselves, I can't recommend a better way of doing it than getting a hold of this book, Ecofascism, Lessons from the German Experience by Janet Biel and Peter Staudenmeier, published in softcover by the AK Press. It's a very short book. It's a good read, and it's an important read. Also, please utilize the Spitfire website and the linked websites. It's an entire mini library of old anti-fascist books that will serve as a great basis for education. And don't neglect the websites by sister station WFMU, and also the For the Record supplemental section on the blog sphere, a huge and growing body of information with which to educate yourselves. This concludes Side 2 of For the Record program number 629, It's Not Easy Being Green, Part 2, Ecofascism. This has been recorded on March 16th of 2008. My name is Dave Emery. Thanks for listening.